Hello and welcome to the first section of threat modeling for Agile and DevSecOps, where we're going to be looking at the background and history of threat modeling, where these ideas, where these methods came from. And this first section, we'll be looking at the background. So where did the whole thing originate? And to really understand that, we have to go back quite a long way. So we're looking more than a couple of thousand years. In somewhere around 512 BCE, Sun Tzu famously wrote The Art of War that's been converted into so many forms and interpretations since. But the key for what we're looking at is that this was the first extensive treatise discussing what we now think of as threat modeling. So proposing ideas around attempting to anticipate what an opponent is going to do, what their motivation is, what tactics they might have, and what resources they might have, and therefore how you can foil their attacks. And we skip forward a few thousand years after that to the first cyber attack, which took place in the 1960s, and amusingly it was carried out by an academic from MIT. This was Dr. Alan Scher, and he was asked to look into the performance of the new computer system. Now, at this point, we were talking mainframe computers, so time on them was portioned out to different accounts, different users. Because he decided he needed more time, he found a way to access the passwords for all users. And then, realizing that that might be considered a problem, to cover up his tracks, he spread the credentials throughout the university campus so that it wasn't obvious who'd compromised them and anyone could use them. And we still see a similar approach today with cloud computing, where attackers compromise or steal credentials from public sources to access cloud infrastructure and spin up instances for their own ends. And that's a really common exploit. So following this, the idea of threat modeling for cybersecurity purposes began to surface and be discussed in academic circles. And then the next big step was in 1977, when architect Christopher Alexander wrote a book called A Pattern Language. And this explained the concept of using design patterns to solve common challenges in building design. He was that type of architect, not a system architect or software architect as we might have now. But the concept, the idea of having these patterns that you can reuse and put together in different ways still applies just as much to software architecture or security architecture or any other architectural process. It's a generic approach to solve that problem. And when we are working through a threat modeling process, when we're using threat modeling, these architectural patterns and architectural principles are vital to reduce the effort required at each stage. And that's important, and we'll get on to why that is later in the course. Then 11 years later, in 1988, Robert Barnard developed the first documented profile of an attacker. And this is another key component to modern threat modeling methodologies. Now, Barnard focused on only one set of attackers, but the core of his approach has led to threat modeling techniques such as abuse cases and persona non grata, which we will again be looking at later in the course. Now the timeline starts to accelerate here because we've only got a few years before Edward Amoroso's book, Fundamentals of Computer Security Technology, was published in 1994. And in that he discussed threat trees. And around the same time, there was independent research by DARPA and the NSA, which made use of a graph depicting how attacks might be carried out, ultimately leading to the very similar approach to threat trees of attack trees. Again, we'll be looking at those throughout the course. 1998 saw Bruce Schneier's paper toward a security system engineering methodology, which built on that previous work to develop an attack tree approach, setting the goal of the attack at the root or top of a tree, depending which way you looked at it, and then working backwards through dependencies. And it would only be another year before Lauren Kornfelder and Prerit Garg at Microsoft developed the STRIDE methodology, based on Schneier's work, among others, to apply to the way that Microsoft developed software and help them secure that software as it was built. listing out potential attacks against system designs. Stride became a very popular, a very well-known threat modeling methodology. It was straightforward to understand and apply, and is still used by many people today, not by Microsoft. Again, we'll get into that. But due to its popularity and due to it being universally applied outside of the context it was built for, which was Microsoft's own software ecosystem, it may actually have slowed down the development of threat modeling in general. Now, while the story does not end in 2004, that was the release of the first book specifically on threat modeling, which was creatively titled Threat Modeling by Frank Swiderski and Window Snyder, and the first release of the Microsoft Threat Analysis and Modeling tool, which was a tool which allowed you to drop in information about a system, and it would then automate creation of the threat model. That's a very brief whistle-stop tour of the history of threat modeling and the background that we'll be covering and where all of this came from. So next, what we'll be looking at in the next section is what goals do we have for threat modeling? What is it we are actually trying to achieve? What are we trying to do? And we'll be going on to that very soon.